Reverb is one of those things where you really have hundreds of tools and techniques that you can use, which can be kind of overwhelming, especially if you're starting out. So I wanted to share an approach that I picked up a few years back, which really helped me out to kind of organize my reverb game. So yeah, let's jump right in. So the thing about reverb that's kind of cool, but also kind of tricky at the same time, is that you can do pretty much whatever you want with it. So you can create a track that's really dry and in your face, doesn't have much reverb at all, like this one, for example. But then you can also have these classic house tracks, which are completely drowned in reverb, like this one, for example. Kind of skipping ahead here. So reverb is this thing that you can use kind of subtly to create a feeling of space. You can really crank it up to make it a more audible element. It can also become something like a subtle effect sound, like in this track, for example. Or more obviously, talking about effect sounds, you can have stuff like this. So reverb can be so many different things, and there's so many different tools and types of reverbs that it can be a bit tough at the beginning. I remember starting out, I was kind of looking for a concept that I could use to create the vibe and the spatial feeling that I kind of wanted to create. And I was throwing different types of reverbs on every single channel to get the results that I wanted, but it didn't really work. And I was wondering why, until I found a tutorial by Chris Lord-Alge, one of the better mixing engineers out there.
So I see sessions where everything's got its own individual reverb, okay? Which is great if you like that sound. But I feel that if you want to mix with depth, when you share your sounds through common reverbs, that commonality gives the sound of a record a blend, a landscape that actually works together. If everything has something individual on it, each one of these individual elements starts to poke out of the mix. And to me, that's not what I like. That's not what I prefer.
So that was really helpful to me because I realized using all of these different types of reverbs and trying to bring them together might not be the easiest approach. Looking back now, I know you can use different reverbs for different types of things if you make electronic music, but if you just want to start out, it can make a lot more sense to use just a few reverbs and then combine them to the sound that you want. And you might wonder, what type of reverbs should you use for this?
I need a typical plate with pre-delay. I need a tight, bright room. I need a long haul. And I need something weird, which is like the non-lin sound, so it has a different envelope.
Okay, nice. So let's try out what he says here and jump into the project that you heard in the preview, just like this little house beat. So what I did here, instead of throwing an individual reverb on every single thing, I created 4 return tracks. And we can just listen to these real quick. Just used some presets. So we have Ableton's reverb right here to create some ambience. Then we have a bright room. Also Ableton's reverb. Kind of a longer plate. I use Valhalla plate for that. And then we have a quirky sound, which is one of my secret weapons, Convolugy XT, which I'm going to talk about more at the end of the video. So now we have these 4 things. And like he said, it's not that we just have 4 reverbs. We can kind of combine them to create more reverbs because the mixture of them will actually give us many ways to create different types of sounds. And he calls it flavors in his video.
I find that to dispel the myth, it's like look at your reverbs and delays as flavors, not as I have to have one on every track. That's just my way of doing it.
So using this approach makes a lot of sense in a way because we already have so many different reverbs floating around in our projects. So if you're using synthesizers like Diva, for example, in this case, it's a bass, but many times you already have effect sounds and reverbs and stuff on your leads, on your elements. If you, for example, grab some percussion sounds or melodic sounds, many times they already have a bunch of reverb on there. Let's just go into the congas, for example. Some of them seem dry, and then others have reverb, like this one. So in our projects, there are a bunch of different reverbs floating around, and if you want to get your spatial dimensions under control, maybe ditch them all and cut off some reverb tails and try it this way. And if you're wondering which ones should I use, maybe this guy isn't necessarily a house guy, he's more like making rock music and stuff like this. But I also saw actually Toman, who's a pretty good electronic dance music producer, using a similar approach in a tutorial that he made. So I would say an ambience, a room, which is a shorter reverb, like mid-length reverb, then a long reverb, and then something quirky can be a great starting point. And then if you feel like you have to add more, you can definitely add more. All right, so let's now jump into the project and take a look at what we can do with these different reverbs. I went ahead and turned off the return track so we can just listen to the track in dry. Let's go ahead and do that for a second. So relatively dry, maybe on some of these drums, there's a small reverb tail on the sample, but besides that, it's kind of dry, which could already work like this. Maybe it's something that you like, but I wanted to create a bit of space around there. So let's actually start with the congas. This was the ambience. Seize the plate. This would just be the plate. Let's just intuitively dial these in a bit. These are the tops. And let's bring in the ambient sound. You can see how it creates the space, right? This is the room. Okay, so just on the clap, this is the room. Sounds like this short thing. And then the ambience is this long thing. So now you might want to have something nice and dense right after the clap, but also have this long tail. So combining these, let's bring in the room and exaggerate. Still kind of sounds like one reverb. Let's bring in the plate. Just the plate on the clap. It's kind of similar to the ambience, but it's a bit more dense. But now together, they form one reverb, right? So let's bring in other elements or just do the whole tops track. Very wet ambience on the clap. Maybe dial it back a bit. Okay. If we have a ride that comes in at a point, for example, just with our plate, we can create this really nice stereo effect and create more spacious vibe. This is the room. Okay, but let's listen to everything kind of in context. Let's stitch the ride again. The chord is kind of dry. Some room onto the snare. So you can use this approach to create many cool different vibes. If you need different types of reverb, I would always start replacing the 4 ones that you have instead of doing another one on an extra channel. Your computer and your CPU will thank you for that as well. Just as a quick reminder, at the beginning I said there's really no right or wrong. So many times people think there's no reverb supposed to be on the bass, for example. But if we listen to the bass line by Kerry Chandler's remix of You're in My System, you can tell that there's quite a lot of reverb on this bass, for example. So a pretty crazy amount. I just wanted to throw that in there. So usually when you walk into a room and you want to check if there's a lot of reverb, you've probably seen people clap and stuff like this, right? Because this way you kind of trigger the reverb. So a very nice way to find out more about reverbs and what they sound like and what they do is to use a clap. Before we jump into single reverb tools, let's check out a few more tracks, because once again, there's no right or wrong. There are many different ways to approach your reverb on claps, for example. This one, I already showed this in an older video. This track by Liquid Earth. There's like no reverb on this clap, right? And it doesn't get more later on. So there are other elements which kind of make up the space and give you like some dimensions and spatial things to listen to, but the clap is very dry. It doesn't have to be a problem and can actually have quite an impact on the rhythm. Because if you have this very short, snappy clap with no reverb, it kind of does something rhythmically. Let's listen to a track with slightly more reverb on the clap. Things gets a bit more spacey. It's not as snappy and short and tight, but still kind of, right? So let's listen to another clap. Now the clap has a longer tail and you get this focus on the clap, which also has an impact on the rhythm. So there's so many things to talk about when it comes to reverb. I just want to throw some of the important things in there. We're going to talk about more things in future videos. But here, you can tell how the clap becomes more prominent and relevant in the rhythm because of the reverb that it has. And actually, what the track does here, every time this cool vocal comes in, the clap actually goes away, so it doesn't take up this space. So, just a little crash course on reverb and rhythm. A clap is always a good thing that we can use for that. What do I have here? Yeah, another nice example. The clap is kind of mono, grainy, it has a tail on there, but it becomes more sound of the clap instead of giving this feeling of space. So let's stay with clap sounds for a while, because like I said, they're kind of nice to figure out things about reverb. So we have this 505 hand clap. That's kind of nice and dry. Let's make it even a bit more dry and cut off the tail. So now we have this clap sound, right? Let's open up Valhalla Room. Not because this is this great reverb that I would recommend, but it's nice to show some things, because most reverbs have something in common in how they work. And so we can take a look at those things right now. Basically, what you're kind of trying to do with a reverb is kind of recreate the sound in a specific room or a specific space. Reverbs are just reflections of a signal, right? So when I'm speaking, things are bouncing off the walls. Depending on where you are, you have different types of reverb. So you might be in a church, so there's this classic big church reverb. You might be in a concert hall. But even if you're outside in the woods, the trees reflect the sound of certain sounds. So there's always this feeling of space, if you're thinking of like space in a more natural sense. And when you're working with reverbs, doesn't matter if it's this one or another one, usually they're kind of divided in two sections: early reflections and late reflections. Because what happens is, if you're, for example, in a room like a hallway that's kind of long but has close walls on the other side, you will get some quick reflections from the sounds from a sound source coming to you, and then you will have some stuff that's coming later. For example, if you're in a small room, there will be many early reflections because the distance is kind of short, but if you're in the Grand Canyon, you will get more something like an echo. So we're focusing on reverb in this video, but delays are also kind of reverbs in that sense that they're reflections of certain things. So we have early and late reflections. And here, in this room, you can have this depth slider, which is basically just controlling the mix between early and late reflections. So all the settings you have in here are kind of thought of for you to decide two things or a few things. you have a sound source that's being reflected, right? Then you kind of have the dimensions of the room. Then you have usually a sound source and a microphone. So depending on where the sound is and where the microphone is, there will be some time differences on basically what type of reverb will be recorded. And then you have different walls or different materials which reflect sound in a different way. So you kind of have some modulation options usually, right? And lots of talking. Let's actually jump in. So let's work with the early reflections. So here we can skip between early and late. Let's just jump in the early reflections over here. And the depth says that low values are more early reflections. So let's turn this all the way down so we just have the early reflections. That's it. Let's actually go mix 50-50 so we have our sound and the reverb. So these are the early reflections. Usually this very dense sound, which almost sounds like a copy, like a grainy copy of the original sound. Pre-delay decides how much later the early reflections come in. So this is almost instant. They kind of become one sound. Here it becomes kind of like an echo. If you hear these nice dense clap sounds and you want to densen up your clap basically, many times it's not necessarily the clap sample or whatever. You can create this with adding the right amount and the right timing of early reflections. Check this out. So we're going from this to this. Okay. The decay doesn't really do much here because we're just focusing on the early reflections, and the decay usually influences the later reflections. So all the stuff that's bouncing around and staying there for a longer amount of time. So let's bring those in for a second. So we're bringing up the depth. Okay, so the decay decides how long is the reverb supposed to be. Okay, so that's very simple. You can decide the length of the reflections. You can kind of decide when the first reflections are coming in, and then you can mix between the two. And then here the modulation, usually you would work with some chorusing because kind of things are bouncing around and interfering and phasing each other. So I don't want to jump too deep into this. There should probably be a video just about Valhalla Room. But if we now jump into, for example, the reverb of Ableton Live, we kind of have a similar situation. We have this early reflection section where you can say, well, we have the amount of modulation in here, but the shape is what decides how many early reflections are in there. So let's bring this down. Something that's kind of cool about reverbs is that you don't necessarily need to understand everything that's happening in here because you find so many well-named presets that usually work pretty good. And you don't have to fine-tune them necessarily. I feel like reverbs is one of those things where you can definitely get away very easily with just picking presets. Something that you should know or consider, though, is that sometimes these names can be kind of misleading. So you have the Valhalla vintage verb, which is kind of similar to vintage things that have been used in the past. And while that's kind of true, it always kind of depends what you send into the reverb, because what you send into the reverb also impacts what comes out of it. And if you send in a sound that's really modern and doesn't sound vintage, I don't think it will sound that vintage if you throw the vintage verb on there. So you could know about all these different reverb plugins and things, but there's one secret sauce that I'm using for pretty much everything, and that's Convology XT. And I don't have any affiliation with them, even though you can click this affiliate link and buy it if you're interested and support this channel in this way. But I really, really like this because convolution reverb is kind of a topic for itself. It kind of measures the reverb and then replicates it instead of using an algorithm or calculating it in that plugin on the fly. So what they did is they went ahead and kind of measured all these different vintage models, which are really, really cool. So you have a very big list with different reverbs, all in here, and they're kind of replicating that. So if you're looking for plate reverbs, spring reverbs, different effects, that's all in here. And since I like to kind of make old school house and things like that for my music, I tend to go to Convolugy XT pretty much all the time because it's such a nice, powerful tool, which has all these classics in here. It has its limits, it has its character and stuff, but it's kind of nice to have one tool and many options in there. They're like organized by year and stuff. So I can just recommend for you to check this one out. Yeah, this was kind of all over the place, but we got to start somewhere, right? So I hope you found this helpful. Hope to see you in the next one. Let me know in the comments what you think, what topics on reverb specifically you want to take a look at, and then we can dive in a bit deeper. But this was kind of a start to get things going, right? Hope to see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao.